The diamond-encrusted wedding ring on Sophia Marchetti's finger was worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. But as she lay dying on the marble floor of their Dubai penthouse, blood pooling around the $2 million Harry Winston necklace her husband had given her just hours before, that ring would become evidence in one of the UAE's most shocking murder cases. If you're fascinated by true crime stories that expose the dark secrets behind wealth and luxury, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These stories from the world's most exclusive circles will shock you to your core. But let's go back to where it all began. Alexander Dimitri was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he entered any room. At 42, the Greek-born real estate mogul had built an empire that stretched from the glittering towers of Dubai Marina to exclusive properties in Monaco and Manhattan. His portfolio was worth over $3 billion, making him one of the youngest billionaires in the Middle East. With his perfectly styled dark hair, piercing blue eyes, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never hearing the word no, Alexander was accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. And in March 2024, what he wanted was sitting at a corner table in Nobu, Dubai, laughing with friends while completely unaware that her life was about to change forever. Sophia Marchetti was 28 years old and possessed the kind of effortless beauty that made heads turn without her even trying. Her long auburn hair caught the restaurant's ambient lighting as she gestured animatedly, telling a story that had her companions hanging on every word. She worked as a luxury travel consultant, helping ultra-wealthy clients plan exclusive vacations to destinations most people could only dream of visiting. It was a job that had given her access to the world's elite, but she had always remained on the periphery, professional and polished, but never truly part of their world. That night in March, she was celebrating a successful quarter with her colleagues when Alexander's business associate pointed her out from across the restaurant. "See that woman in the black dress?" Dimitri's lawyer, Marcus Ramon, had whispered. "Sophia Marchetti. She planned the Bahrain royal family's private island retreat last month. Absolute professional, but there's something mysterious about her. Very different from the usual social climbers you meet in this city." Alexander studied Sophia from his table, watching how she carried herself with a quiet confidence that intrigued him. Unlike the attention-seeking socialites who usually orbited his world, she seemed genuinely uninterested in the wealth and status symbols surrounding her. When their eyes met across the restaurant, she held his gaze for just a moment before looking away, not with the calculated coyness he was used to, but with what appeared to be genuine disinterest. For a man who had spent his adult life having women throw themselves at him, Sophia's indifference was like a challenge he couldn't ignore. He sent over a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon with a handwritten note. "For someone who clearly has excellent taste in restaurants. Would you join me for dinner tomorrow? A.D." Sophia read the note and glanced over at Alexander's table, where he was watching her reaction with obvious amusement. She folded the note carefully, stood up, and walked directly to his table with the kind of confidence that made every conversation in the restaurant pause. "Mr. Dimitri," she said, having clearly recognized him despite never having met him personally. "Thank you for the champagne, but I don't date clients or potential clients. It's bad for business." Alexander laughed, genuinely delighted by her directness. "I'm not looking for a travel consultant, Miss Marchetti. I'm looking for dinner conversation with an interesting woman who isn't impressed by expensive champagne." "Then you're looking in the wrong place," Sophia replied with a slight smile. "Because I actually am impressed by expensive champagne. I just don't let it cloud my judgment." She turned to leave, but Alexander stood up, extending his hand. "One dinner. If you find me boring, you never have to see me again. But if I can surprise you, then maybe we can surprise each other." There was something in his tone that made Sophia pause. Despite her initial dismissal, she found herself curious about the man who had built an empire before turning 40 and who seemed genuinely intrigued by her refusal rather than offended by it. Against her better judgment, she shook his hand. "One dinner, Mr. Dimitri, but somewhere normal. Not another place where the menu doesn't list prices." That first dinner led to a second, then a third, and within 6 months, Sophia found herself living in a world she had only observed from the outside. Alexander was unlike anyone she had ever met, brilliant and driven, but also surprisingly thoughtful and genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. He didn't try to buy her affection with expensive gifts, instead winning her over with late-night conversations about art, literature, and their shared love of travel to places that weren't featured in luxury magazines. By December 2024, Alexander Dmitri had done something he had never done in his adult life. He had fallen completely, obsessively in love. Sophia had moved into his sprawling penthouse in the Burj Al Arab, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Dubai's coastline and Palm Jumeirah. But more than just sharing his space, she had somehow managed to penetrate the carefully constructed walls he had built around his emotions since childhood. Every morning, he would wake up to find her on the balcony with her coffee, reading something on her tablet, completely comfortable in the luxury that surrounded her, but never seeming to take it for granted. She would ask him about his business deals not because she wanted access to his money, but because she was genuinely curious about how his mind worked. When he told her about growing up poor in Athens, watching his father's construction business fail, and his mother clean office buildings to keep food on the table, Sophia listened without the pity or awkward sympathy he usually encountered from wealthy women who had never known real struggle. Instead, she shared her own story about growing up in a middle-class family in Florence, watching her parents work multiple jobs to send her to university, and how she had promised herself she would never depend on anyone else for her financial security. What Alexander didn't know was that Sophia's story, while partially true, was carefully edited to hide the more complicated reality of her past. She had indeed grown up in Florence, but her family's financial struggles had been far more severe than she let on. Her father, Marco Marchetti, had been a small-time art dealer who had gotten involved with some very dangerous people when his legitimate business failed. By the time Sophia was 20, her father owed money to individuals who didn't accept late payments or excuses. The family had been forced to flee Italy when threats against Sophia and her younger brother became too specific and too frequent to ignore. The luxury travel consulting career that had brought her to Dubai was real, but it had also served as perfect cover for someone who needed to disappear from her old life completely. Her clients were wealthy, discreet, and often preferred to keep their travel arrangements private. It was a job that required creating elaborate itineraries for people who valued anonymity, and Sophia had become expert at understanding how the ultra-wealthy operated, what they wanted, and how to give them exactly that while maintaining her own carefully constructed privacy. When she met Alexander, she had been in Dubai for 3 years, long enough to feel safe, but not long enough to stop looking over her shoulder occasionally. His interest in her had been both thrilling and terrifying, because she knew that the kind of background investigation that men like Alexander routinely conducted on everyone in their lives would eventually uncover the inconsistencies in her story. But as months passed, and he seemed content to accept her carefully curated version of herself, Sophia began to relax into the relationship in a way she hadn't allowed herself to relax in years. Alexander's wealth provided a level of security she had never imagined, and his obvious devotion to her made her feel protected in ways that went far beyond mere physical safety. By the time he proposed in February 2025, with a custom-designed ring that featured a flawless 12-carat diamond surrounded by smaller stones arranged in a pattern that matched the view from their balcony, Sophia had convinced herself that her past didn't matter anymore. The proposal itself was typically Alexander, grand, romantic, and completely private. He had chartered a yacht and taken her to international waters off the coast of Dubai, where they watched the sun set over the city's skyline while dining on a meal prepared by a Michelin-starred chef flown in specifically for the occasion. But when he got down on one knee and told her that she was the first person who had ever made him want to share his life completely, Sophia felt a stab of guilt that surprised her with its intensity. "I'll love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone," she had whispered when she said yes. And the scary thing was that it was completely true. The engagement was announced with the kind of fanfare that only Dubai's social elite could generate. The guest list for their engagement party read like a who's who of international business, royalty, and celebrities. Sophia found herself being photographed for magazines she had only read in dentist offices, being interviewed about wedding plans and her thoughts on being married to one of the world's most eligible bachelors. She handled it all with grace and genuine charm, but privately, she was terrified that the increased attention would somehow lead back to the life she had left behind in Italy. Alexander, meanwhile, was planning what he intended to be the wedding of the decade. He purchased an entire resort in the Maldives for the week, flying in 300 of their closest friends and family members for a celebration that would cost more than most people's annual salaries just for the flowers. He wanted everything to be perfect for Sophia, not just because he loved her, but because he was proud of her in a way that went beyond mere possession. She was intelligent, beautiful, sophisticated, and completely devoted to him. At business dinners and social events, he watched other men watch her and felt a surge of possessive satisfaction that this remarkable woman had chosen him. But as the wedding date approached, Sophia began experiencing panic attacks that she carefully hid from Alexander. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, imagining scenarios where her past caught up with her at the altar, where photographers captured images that somehow made their way back to people she had spent years avoiding. She began taking longer showers, using the sound of running water to mask the sound of her crying, and she started researching what it would take to change her name legally after the marriage, not just as a romantic gesture, but as another layer of protection from a past that felt suddenly very close again. The irony was that Alexander's wealth and status, which should have made her feel completely secure, were also generating exactly the kind of international attention that made her most vulnerable. Their engagement photos appeared in magazines in 12 countries. Their wedding was being covered by media outlets that she hadn't even known existed. For someone who had spent years trying to remain invisible, the spotlight was becoming unbearable. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sophia made a decision that would change everything. She hired a private investigator, not to look into Alexander's background, but to find out exactly what had happened to her father and whether the people he had been involved with were still looking for their family. What she learned made her realize that marrying Alexander might be the biggest mistake of her life, or the only way to stay alive. The private investigator's report arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2025, just 10 days before the wedding. Sophia waited until Alexander left for his morning workout before opening the encrypted email attachment, her hands trembling as she read the contents. Marco Marchetti, her father, was dead. He had been found floating in the Arno River in Florence 6 months after the family had fled Italy, with what local police diplomatically described as injuries consistent with a fall from significant height. The art forgery ring he had gotten involved with was still active, still dangerous, and according to the investigator's sources, still very interested in recovering the money Marco had stolen before his death. The amount was smaller than Sophia had feared, 300,000 euros, but to people who killed over debts, the size of the amount was irrelevant. What terrified her most was the final paragraph of the report. Subject's current location and identity have likely been compromised through recent media coverage of engagement. Recommend immediate relocation or alternative security measures. For 24 hours, Sophia considered calling off the wedding. She drafted a dozen different explanations to Alexander, each one sounding more ridiculous than the last. How could she explain that marrying him might put him in danger? How could she tell the man who had given her everything that she had been lying to him about who she really was from the moment they met? But as she watched him excitedly discussing final wedding preparations with their wedding planner, his face lit up with genuine happiness. She realized she couldn't destroy the life they had built together. Instead, she made a different choice. She would tell him everything after the wedding, when they were safely married, and she had legal protections that would make it harder for anyone to force her to leave Dubai. She would confess her past, and they would deal with it together, as husband and wife. The wedding took place on March 28, 2025, at the one and only Rithi Ra Resort in the Maldives. The ceremony was held at sunset on a private beach, with white roses and orchids flown in from Ecuador, creating an aisle that seemed to float above the crystal-clear water. Sophia walked down the aisle in a custom Valentino gown that had taken 6 months to create, with a cathedral-length veil that caught the ocean breeze and made her look like she was gliding across the sand. Alexander waited at the altar wearing a tuxedo made by the same Seville Rowe tailor who dressed British royalty, his eyes never leaving his bride's face as she approached. The 300 guests included heads of state, Hollywood celebrities, tech billionaires, and royalty from 5 different countries. The ceremony was performed by a judge flown in from Dubai specifically for the occasion, and the reception featured performances by artists whose concerts typically sold out stadiums. But despite the opulence surrounding them, the moment when Sophia and Alexander exchanged vows felt surprisingly intimate and genuine. When Alexander promised to love and protect her for the rest of their lives, Sophia felt her carefully controlled emotions finally break through. Tears streamed down her face as she promised to be faithful and honest with him forever. The weight of her planned confession making the words feel both true and terrible. The reception lasted until nearly 3 in the morning, with guests dancing on a specially constructed floor that extended over the water and drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. Sophia moved through the evening like she was in a dream, accepting congratulations from people whose names she recognized from Forbes lists and international news headlines, all while knowing that everything was about to change. She and Alexander had rented the resort's most exclusive villa for their wedding night, a sprawling complex built over the water with its own private beach, infinity pool, and glass-wall bedroom that offered unobstructed views of the Indian Ocean. As the last guests finally departed and the cleaning crews began dismantling the elaborate decorations, Sophia and Alexander were finally alone for the first time as husband and wife. They stood on their private deck, still in their wedding attire, watching the sun begin to rise over the water and sharing a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon that had been chilling since the ceremony ended. Alexander had never looked happier, and Sophia had never felt more terrified. "I can't believe you're actually my wife," Alexander said, pulling her close and kissing the top of her head. "Sometimes I still can't believe you said yes to that first dinner." "Alexander," Sophia said quietly, her heart beginning to race, "there are things about my past that you don't know. Things I should have told you before now." He pulled back to look at her, his expression shifting from contentment to concern. "What kind of things?" "Things that might change how you feel about me," she whispered. "Things that might put you in danger." Alexander's jaw tightened as he processed what she was saying. In the business world, he had learned to recognize the difference between minor complications and serious threats, and something in Sophia's tone told him this wasn't going to be a conversation about old boyfriends or family embarrassments. "Tell me," he said simply, but there was already a coldness creeping into his voice that Sophia had never heard before. Sophia took a deep breath and began to tell her husband the truth about who she really was. She started with her father's art forgery business, explaining how Marco Marchetti had gotten involved with dangerous people when his legitimate gallery failed. She told him about the threats, the midnight phone calls, the morning when they found their car windows smashed with a note warning them they had 1 week to pay what they owed. Alexander listened in silence, his face becoming more rigid with each revelation. When she explained how they had fled Italy in the middle of the night, leaving behind everything they owned, he began pacing across the deck of their honeymoon villa. But it was when she admitted that even her name was partially fabricated, that she had been Sophia Marchetti, not Sophia, and had changed the spelling when she created her new identity in Dubai, that something dangerous flickered in Alexander's eyes. "Let me understand this," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "You've been lying to me about your identity from the moment we met. Your family history, your background, even your name, all lies." "Not lies," Sophia said desperately. "Just not the complete truth. I was protecting myself, and I was protecting you. If these people found me, you were protecting me." Alexander's laugh was bitter and cold. "By marrying me under a false identity, by bringing whatever criminal connections your family has into my life. Do you have any idea what this could do to my business, to my reputation?" Sophia had expected him to be upset, even angry, but the coldness in his voice frightened her more than shouting would have. This was the Alexander she had heard about in business circles, the man who destroyed competitors without mercy when they crossed him. She had just never imagined that look being directed at her. "I hired a private investigator," she continued, hoping that being completely honest now might salvage the situation. "My father is dead. He was killed 6 months after we left Italy. The people he owed money to are still active, and they might know where I am because of all the media coverage of our wedding." Alexander stopped pacing and turned to stare at her. "You hire an investigator? When?" 3 weeks ago. I was terrified that marrying you would put you in danger, but I was also terrified of losing you. I thought if we were married, we could face this together. Face this together?" Alexander's voice rose for the first time. "You mean face the consequences of your family's criminal activities? Face threats from people who kill for money? You decided to make that my problem without even asking me." The man Sophia had fallen in love with was disappearing before her eyes, replaced by someone cold and calculating. She could see him processing the implications, the potential threats to his business empire, the embarrassment of being deceived by his own wife, the realization that their entire relationship had been built on lies. "Alexander, I love you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Everything about my feelings for you has been real. I know I should have told you sooner, but I was scared. You love me." He looked at her with something approaching disgust. "You don't even know what love means. Love is honesty. Love is trust. Love is not manipulating someone in a marriage while hiding the fact that you might bring killers into their life." "I never manipulated you," Sophia protested. "My feelings for you are genuine." "Your feelings?" Alexander's voice was getting louder, more dangerous. "What about my feelings? What about the fact that I trusted you completely? What about the fact that I introduced you to my business associates, my friends, people whose opinions can make or break deals worth millions of dollars?" He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Do you understand what you've done to me? I've spent 20 years building my reputation, building relationships based on trust, and now I find out that my own wife is a fraud." Sophia tried to pull away from his grip, but Alexander's hands tightened. The romantic, thoughtful man she had married was completely gone, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. "You're hurting me," she whispered. "I'm hurting you." Alexander laughed bitterly. "You have destroyed everything I've worked for. When this gets out, and it will get out because people like you always get exposed, my business partners will wonder what else I've been lying about. My competitors will use this against me. Do you think anyone will trust a man who can't even properly investigate his own wife?" The fight escalated as Sophia tried to defend herself, explaining that she had been young and scared when she created her new identity, that she had never intended for the deception to go on so long, that she had been planning to tell him the truth all along. But each explanation only made Alexander angrier, and Sophia began to realize that the man she had married was capable of violence she had never imagined. When she tried to walk away from the conversation, to give them both time to calm down, Alexander blocked her path. "You don't get to walk away from this," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You created this situation, and you're going to deal with the consequences." The luxury villa that had been designed for romance became a prison as Alexander's need for control and his rage of being deceived transformed him into someone capable of unthinkable acts. The sound of crashing waves below their deck would soon mask sounds that no honeymoon suite should ever contain. The confrontation moved from the deck into the villa's glass-walled bedroom as Alexander's rage continued to build. What had started as shock and disappointment had transformed into something much darker, a need to punish Sophia for making him feel foolish, for threatening the empire he had spent decades building, for daring to deceive the man who prided himself on controlling every aspect of his life. Sophia tried desperately to calm the situation, to make him understand that her love for him was real, even if her past had been hidden. But Alexander was beyond reason now, seeing her not as the woman he had married, but as a threat to everything he valued most: his reputation, his business relationships, and his carefully constructed image as a man who was always in control. "Please, Alexander," she begged as he cornered her near the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered their spectacular ocean view. "We can fix this. We can hire security. We can deal with any threats together. I'll do whatever you want me to do. What I want." Alexander's voice was frighteningly calm now. "What I want is to never have met you. What I want is for the last year of my life to have been real instead of an elaborate con game." He grabbed her wrist as she tried to move past him, his grip so tight that her wedding bracelet cut into her skin. "You made me into a fool, Sophia. Or Sophia, or whatever your real name is. You made me look weak in front of people whose respect I've spent 20 years earning." The physical struggle began when Sophia tried to break free from his grip. In desperation, she scratched his face, leaving 3 deep marks across his cheek that immediately began to bleed. The sight of his own blood seemed to snap whatever remaining control Alexander had been maintaining. "You want to fight?" he said, his voice deadly quiet. "After everything you've done, you want to fight me?" What happened next would be reconstructed later by forensic experts who found evidence of a violent struggle that moved throughout the villa's main room. Sophia fought desperately for her life, But Alexander was bigger, stronger, and consumed by a rage that gave him terrifying focus. She managed to grab a heavy crystal sculpture from the coffee table, striking him in the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble, but it only increased his fury. The struggle continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which Sophia tried multiple times to escape, to reach the door, to call for help on her phone. But the villa's isolation, which had seemed so romantic when they checked in, now worked against her. The nearest occupied villa was over a quarter-mile away, and the sound of waves crashing against the stilts below masked her screams. Alexander later claimed that he hadn't intended to kill her, that he had been trying to restrain her when she fell and struck her head on the marble edge of the infinity pool that extended from their bedroom. But forensic analysis would tell a different story, one of sustained violence that culminated in Sophia being held underwater in the shallow end of the pool until she stopped struggling. By dawn, Alexander was sitting calmly on the deck of their honeymoon villa, still wearing his blood-stained tuxedo shirt, sipping champagne and watching the sunrise over the Indian Ocean. When resort staff arrived at noon to check on the newlyweds, they found him in the same position, seemingly in shock, claiming that his wife had slipped and fallen during an early morning swim. But the blood evidence throughout the villa, the defensive wounds on Sophia's body, and the fact that she was found fully clothed in her wedding dress told investigators a very different story. The investigation that followed became international news, partly because of Alexander's wealth and status, but mostly because of the shocking contrast between the fairy tale wedding that had been photographed for magazines worldwide and the brutal reality of what had happened just hours later. The Maldivian police, working with international investigators, quickly determined that Sophia's death was not an accident. Alexander was arrested 3 days after the murder, as he attempted to leave the country on his private jet. His legal team, the same lawyers who had helped him build his business empire, now found themselves defending a man whose carefully constructed image had been completely destroyed by one night of uncontrolled violence. During the trial, which lasted for 8 months, Alexander's defense team argued that he had been provoked beyond reason by his wife's deception, that learning about her criminal family connections and false identity had caused a psychological break that led to temporary insanity. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the trauma of discovering that one spouse had been lying about their fundamental identity, the business implications of being deceived so completely, and the cultural pressures faced by men in Alexander's position. But the prosecution painted a different picture of a man who had always been controlling and violent, whose business success had come from his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his interests. They presented evidence of previous relationships where Alexander had been possessive and threatening, business deals where he had used intimidation tactics, and a pattern of behavior that suggested Sophia's murder was not an aberration, but the inevitable result of his need to control everyone around him. The most damning evidence came from the villa's security system, which had recorded audio of the final confrontation. The jury heard Alexander's voice, cold and calculated, telling Sophia that she had signed her own death warrant by deceiving him, followed by the sounds of the struggle and Sophia's increasingly desperate pleas for mercy. When a verdict came down, guilty of first-degree murder, Alexander showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and his business empire began to crumble as partners distanced themselves and investigators looked into his other activities. The revelation of Sophia's hidden past, which had emerged during the trial, added another layer of tragedy to the story. The private investigator's report that had triggered her confession was found in her personal belongings, revealing that she had been trying to protect both herself and Alexander by telling him the truth. The Italian criminals who had been searching for her father's money were arrested just weeks after the murder, their organization dismantled by police who had been tracking them for years. Sophia's confession, which had cost her life, had been unnecessary. The threat she had been so afraid of was already neutralized. Today, Alexander Dmitri serves his sentence in a maximum security prison, his billion-dollar empire sold off to pay legal fees and victim compensation. The luxury villa where Sophia died has been renovated and returned to service, but staff members still remember the morning when paradise became a crime scene. The case remains a stark reminder that behind the glittering facade of wealth and luxury, the same dark emotions that drive people to violence in any environment can flourish. For those who knew both Alexander and Sophia, The tragedy serves as a warning about the dangers of deception in relationships, but also about the terrifying consequences when love turns to possessive rage. In the end, 2 lives were destroyed by a combination of past mistakes, present deceptions, and the toxic collision of love, pride, and uncontrolled violence in a place where paradise and hell proved to be separated by nothing more than one man's capacity for forgiveness.